Hey, Christoph, thank you for coming in. You have such a tremendous background, having impact across so many communities, so many years of just amazing, outstanding success, and the work is continuing, winning many awards. And you speak all these languages as well, so it's just really, really remarkable. And thank you for coming in and sharing your insights with my audience.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me, and really happy to be here.
So, Christoph, my audience consists of CEOs and investors and board members, a lot of them actually, and then also scientists and people who work in technology mainly, but also many other areas. And they're always curious, somebody with your kind of background who's had so much impact in their lives. They're always curious about what were two or three inflection points that made this wonderful person you are today.
Yeah, there definitely are these points, and I think sometimes in life, I say sometimes life gives us a kick in the ass, literally, just to say wake up, and I've grown up in a very safe country. I've grown up in Switzerland, and it's everything. It's perfect in a sense. We all imagine the postcard country, and it's been like that for me. But I was very, very hungry for the world. And the first one was really, I was very blessed to have been raised in a family. My parents are both medical doctors. And very, very early on, they introduced me to the challenges of this world. And in this case, it was mostly working with people who are physically challenged, so disabled persons. And it really opened a different dimension. And it also broke down sort of a bit the fear that comes with that. And you realize there's so many realities outside of your own. And another one was certainly, and that was probably the most life-changing experiences. Just after my 30th birthday in 2006, I was sent on an emergency mission to the Central African Republic, and I was almost killed in an assassination. It was an extremely volatile and difficult situation, and we were on a humanitarian mission, and our vehicle was attacked and literally holed with bullets. Yeah, the fact that we survived that attack was a pure miracle, and it really reinforced my belief that that I want to use a good or a lot of my energy actually to help people who are in much less fortunate situations and who need help.
I'm just reflecting upon what you just indicated. So your parents were doctors, but that really exposed you to this idea of inclusion and diversity and thinking of the other and the other's journey and having empathy for people who have different circumstances and different challenges. And then you go through this really challenging situation where you could have been seriously hurt or and so on, and it made you aware that and drove your passion to say, I want to be on the other side. I want to make sure I help people in a good way. So what was the first job that's really was a realization of this journey that you're on and this background that you have?
Yeah, it's interesting because initially, I studied arts and I was working as a painter, in fact. And I had my studio in Paris, and I actually managed to make a living from arts. But there was always that hunger to do more. So, for example, I launched a big expedition called Bike for Help. And I cycled alone from India to Switzerland to raise funds for people affected by leprosy. What was quite remarkable about it is I think you come up with this idea. I was a young student and I just thought like, I want to do this and raise some funds. But what amazed me was I took people on the journey. People were with me. I was writing for newspapers. I was on the news all the time and so on. And suddenly you start inspiring people and you realize that they are realizing how many different realities are out there. And I think this has gone through my whole life over the time. I've worked for in leadership roles for big international organizations, like I worked for the UN, for the International Committee of the Red Cross, for World Vision. And But at the same time, I was then also working for the World Economic Forum, where my role, and it was often my role, is really be that bridge between different worlds and bring the different actors together. Because I think I realized also that so many want to make a change, but sometimes just don't know how to do it. And sometimes they're also a little bit afraid. There's a lot of unknowns out there. And it was very satisfying, or I loved the role of being that bridge builder between those different worlds.
Let's talk about the world vision. What were some of your challenges? What were some of the stories that moved you at World Vision, and your satisfaction in terms of achieving some of the goals and the challenges, compared to maybe some of the other communities that you were a part of?
Yeah, I think, I've been now CEO of World Vision Switzerland and Liechtenstein for a few years. And I tell you a little story, and I think it signifies some of the successes and just showing a bit of a bigger picture. In January this year, for example, I went to Uganda, and I went to one of the largest refugee camps in the world called Bidi Bidi, and it's in the West Nile and the West Nile region. And basically, you can just not imagine. 250,000 people. It's just like it's a massive city, and there I met a girl called Evelyn, and Evelyn is severely disabled, and her mother Martha had to flee the war or the unrests in South Sudan, because her husband was killed. She was raped on the way, and she got into this camp, and she was very desperate. But the interesting part is we launched as a pilot there what we called an empowerment program, and we basically gave Martha, she was one of them, but many other women, we empowered them with financial skills and microloans. And it was amazing. She built up her own business, and today she can basically feed also little Evelyn, who's 10 years old and sits in a wheelchair, and she gets the medical care. And it's just amazing, like sitting there with her, hearing her story and feeling that empowerment that she felt was incredibly moving. And I think it just signifies many of the success stories around the world. We just don't hear about them because they're small, but ultimately she's an entrepreneur like so many out there, who's really managed to make a change for herself, for her daughter, and also for the whole community.
When you're working with an organization like World Vision, how would you contrast that with working with World Economic Forum? The culture is different. The manner of execution would be different. Probably ideation would be different, and so on. How would you contrast them? How are they similar, and how are they different?
Of course, if you compare, for example, the World Economic Forum and World Vision or any other humanitarian organization, often it's what is a bit missing on one side is one is so focused on response, and there's needs, and we need to cover the needs, whereas the World Economic Forum is like a platform, and it brings the best players together. And that was also part of my role when I was at the World Economic Forum, was really being, again, that, in a sense, call it the translator between different worlds. Because at the end of the day, even in the humanitarian world, if you want so, it is like in the business world. There is needs, there need to be supplies, there need to be sourcing, etc. So the dynamics are quite similar, but it's a different working culture, it's different company cultures. And so it needs these translations in between to really understand how can we actually help each other, because we ultimately, like many, I would say, conscious companies, really want to contribute for a better world. And there I've seen amazing, tremendous successes, for example, at the World Economic Forum, where sometimes you bring, and this is the great power of a platform organization like the World Economic Forum, you bring together the best minds, the best businesses, and you bring together also the organizations that have the legs on the ground. The results can be remarkable.
And what would you see as the gaps within, let's say, the world vision where you'd like them to be addressed so that they could be more effective, and also within the World Economic Forum, what are the gaps that would make them more effective?
I think sometimes the gaps is more the openness to really bring the right players in, to allow innovation to happen at a faster pace, and to really, let's say, like, to allow enough disruptive thinking to happen. And I think if you look at it, because they're responding to so many crises at the same time, there is, for organizations, there has to be certain guidelines. There's a lot of different rules. But at the same time, what you're constantly required of is actually be innovative, change all the time. And you have to have the right also people and mindset in place. And the same thing happens for companies. I think as I've seen this at the World Economic Forum, the power of an organization like the World Economic Forum, it brings the players together. The magic happens sometimes just behind the scenes. I remember that some of the best outcomes we achieved happened literally in a 15-minute coffee on a coffee table somewhere in busy Davos meeting center, where you bring executives together who make then the right decisions. But you need the decision makers who really say, like, yes, I'm open, and we move forward together.
You also spent time with the United Nations as an operation officer in their relief and works agency. And, you supervised refugee camps and managed humanitarian emergency response and so on. What was that work like on a day-to-day basis? What were the areas that sort of created frustrations for you? And then what are the areas where you would say, yes, this worked? What was that journey like with the UN?
The journey with the UN was an interesting one. I was very impressed by the work that was done. A lot of very dedicated people. Yeah. But sometimes the challenges that you face is like, take the example of a refugee camp. Again, refugee camps are like cities. They have very similar dynamics, but what makes it so different? I always said refugee camps are like places of big question marks. So people come, they don't necessarily come from the same community, so they're just thrown together into a pot, and they don't know when they can ever return. Some camps today, we talk about procrastinated or extended crisis. So sometimes refugees, in the early days, you would always think like, oh, refugees can go back after a few years. And now today we know there's so many camp situations around the world, or even refugee situations in general, where people haven't been able to come back home in many years. But what was interesting in the camps, for example, there's a lot of questions of logistics. So imagine you have suddenly a large amount of people, and I mentioned before a camp like Bidi Bidi, 250,000. Some of the camps that I managed had 25,000 people. So that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of logistics. So there's a lot of your question marks are, how do I get enough drinking water in? How do I get the dirty water out of the camp? What do we do with the garbage? What about the healthcare and the education? And that was fascinating. And I share a little story with you, and it also has a bit to do with the frustration, but we realized that in one of the camps, the camp produced every day roughly 25 tons of garbage. Yeah. But we were only able to get out 18 tons, which meant several tons were left behind every day, and people would burn it illegally in some corners, and it would create a lot of health issues. But then we came up with the idea, why don't we buy these little tractors? You know them from the Italian vineyards. You know these tractors that go between the vines. And we would be able to actually move inside the camps and collect all the garbage. But then UN bureaucracy hits, and it took more than a year to buy these tractors, you know, because again, endless, you know, where's the supplies, etc., and all of that. But it was brilliant. It was the solution, combined with an education program, also to educate people more on how to work with the garbage, how to help, etc., get volunteers together. And ultimately, we solved not only the garbage issue, we solved the health issues, etc. But I think sometimes it's the frustration that you have with bureaucracies that make it challenging.
And then prior to this, you were with the International Committee of the Red Cross, you were head of global communication campaigns and so on, head of different offices like in Colombia and the Palestinian Territory, Central African Republic, Nepal, and so on. What was that like, and what were some of the challenges in working with the ICRC?
I really, I love the organization, and the people extremely dedicated. So you have to always imagine it is not a classical job. We always said like it's a lifestyle, because basically you transport your entire life there. It's not just like, yeah, you go there for a month or for a week or so. You live on the front lines of conflict for quite a long time. And often living conditions were very, very challenging, also because also of security. I often say to my Swiss friends, imagine, I could often not just say like, oh, I'm going for a drink tonight with some friends or go out for dinner. It was just not possible because of the safety concerns to even leave the compound. But what was fascinating is there's so much happening behind the scenes. And a lot what I learned is, as the ICRC works as a neutral organization, really focusing on the people affected by the conflict, our focus was to have a lot of the negotiations with the different conflict parties. So whether that was with the army, whether that was with different separatist groups, which gave me a deep, deep insight into how actually people are functioning, but also how these groups are functioning and how ultimately you can positively influence them in one hand behaving better in war, but very practical things like, you know, I have received over my time with my colleagues, we've received countless, for example, hostages, you know, hostages who wanted to be, you know, were given back, for example, by a rebel group, or making sure that there is you know, fighting against torture in the different prisons, etc. So there was so many examples where it was so right there, right where people needed it the most. And I realized the incredible vulnerability that many people have, and that is you and the actions of the organization is their lifeline. And that was very, very powerful. And all the contexts I was sent in were extremely volatile and challenging. And lucky enough, also in terms of my, let's say, like my resilience muscle, that worked out. I have a very positive nature as a person, and that helped me not to become cynical. Because of course, if you're surrounded by a lot of violence and challenges every day, and you see some of the darkest actions of human beings, it would be very simple to become cynical and actually sad about the world. But it actually gave me even more purpose in thinking, yes, I'm meant to be here, and I'm meant to support the organization doing its best.
All of this is, you know, really fascinating, and I can see all of these imprints of impact, you know, from your parents who were doctors to, you know, transformational experiences you've had where you were under attack and riding your bike and for social causes, and you being this artist, and we'll mind that part a little bit later. But just on the things that we talked about, you know, CEO World Vision and helping children and vulnerable people. And then we didn't talk about this, but you were also with the Switzerland Global Enterprise, the head of associations and their members. And we did talk about the World Economic Forum, and you did so much. You were head of social engagement in Foundations Africa and MENA, and manager of the Global Agenda Council, Global Leadership Fellow, senior manager of the Swap Foundation, etc., and then operations officer with the UN, and then, of course, all of the things you just finished talking about with the International Committee of the Red Cross. All of these very impactful, all of them in very senior leadership roles, all of them where you're constantly under a lot of stress and so on. And yet you decided to spend a little bit of time and join in an organization called YPO. How did you get involved with YPO? Who is YPO? How does that intersect with all of these other roles you have? How are you different from a typical YPO member? And then once we mine some of that experience of YPO, then we'll get to some of your beginning roots as an artist. And you're an award-winning documentarian. So
yeah, so the YPO community is also it's an interesting organization, and I'm really impressed by it. So I've been a member now of YPO for the last 2 years, and YPO basically, as it's called, I mean, YPO is the abbreviation, but it's called the Young Presidents Organization, and basically it's a community of about 30,000 CEOs from around the world. So CEOs, all kinds of business leaders, leaders from different walks of life, who really want to work together on a common vision for a better world. And of course, there's part of it is meet like-minded people, connect with like-minded people, and share experiences. And it was also interesting for me to see their hunger. I mean, there's a lot of people who are in extremely high positions, quite far away from sometimes some of the issues that I'm dealing as a leader, for example, with leading a humanitarian organization. And there again, my contribution was to bring them closer to these worlds and actually see how we can impact that together. And for example, now when the Ukraine war started, I was on the core group and led all the humanitarian response of YPOs from around the world, because they really wanted to do something. They're always eager when there is a problem somewhere. They want to do something, but they just don't know somehow. And because they don't have the experience. And there's very few of us humanitarian leaders who are in YPO, but I always see it as a mutual learning. I learn so much from them, from many of the entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial ideas, find it deeply inspiring. And I hope to be able to bring the same to the others as well.
And you're a board member of the YPO Peace Action Network. Can you describe what that means?
Yeah, so the Peace Action Network is really focusing on, so first of all, these are all YPO members who are member of the Peace Action, what is called Peace Action Network. And they really commit, in a sense, to bring peace to the world. But it's not just peace like in a classical sense. I mean, we would always think about war and things, but it's really different ways also. It could be peace in a company. It could be peace also in your own four walls, in your family. Peace really starts everywhere on a community level. And it's quite beautiful because the Peace Action Network has been around now for many years, and acts as a source of inspiration for other YPOers. But at the same time, it also brings in incredible resources to really talk about challenging issues. I give you just one example. I recently had the privilege, in my role as a board member, to interview or to have a conversation actually with ex-President Santos of Colombia, the Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work he did and bringing the peace treaties with the FARC. And it was it was a very, very moving conversation we had, because of course I was working in Colombia. my side was I was out in the jungle negotiating with the FARC and other rebel groups on humanitarian issues, whilst President Santos was, or his, let's say, like his delegation was negotiating in Cuba on the peace deal. And by the time when I was in Colombia, this was all going on. So it was very interesting for us to have this conversation from the two different perspectives. And he really openly shared what it really needs to bring lasting peace. And I found that very powerful. And I know that the reaction of YPOers was very powerful to that. So again, it opens doors, it inspires, and it also inspires really for people to set action for themselves.
So do you have any events upcoming that you're really sort of excited about and where you think amazing magic is going to happen?
Yeah, the next event that's going to happen, and I'm very excited to be there, is at the beginning of February. There's going to be the YPO Global Impact Summit, where really about 200 leaders from the world impact community are coming together to discuss the next steps or what they're intending to do and how they can collaborate better. So I'm happy also to be there and take them also on a journey, or give my insights, and hope that they can be helpful to the other leaders.
I can see how you're also and somewhat different from many of the YPO members. I mean, I'm an external person, but from my understanding of YPO and having interviewed many YPO members, many of them are professional managers, but they're also from family offices or high net worth families who are generational, and succeeding generations run the businesses within the families. And then there's also entrepreneurs who created startups, and these companies became quite successful, and so on. So you're in this community of people who are managing companies, and typically commercial companies, and you come from an entirely different space. For example, we already mentioned things like World Vision and the International Red Cross and the UN, and there's also the Color the World Foundation, where founder and CEO working with patients with leprosy and people, women suffering mental health issues, and so on. They're very, very successful, and a lot of international fundraising expeditions. Bike for Help, for example, you've done that several times in this humanitarian expedition in Algeria, all of this other work. And yet you're working with these entrepreneurial types, or working with commercial companies. What is that experience like? Because it's a contrast, right?
Yeah, I think it could be easily seen as a contrast. And when I meet all these entrepreneurs, first of all, I'm always impressed how open they are. And I think this is what I also love, for example, about a community like the YPO community. It's a trusted community. It's an open community. And there is a natural sense of curiosity. And this is what I find deeply inspiring. And I think it's a bit also has gone through my life. I was always very interested to go above and beyond and do things better than I did them before. And with the YPOs, it's the same. I think we share in many ways the same, I would say, leadership challenges, whether you're managing, a humanitarian organization, or actually a company producing any kind of thing, service or product. Your challenges are often actually quite similar. And I think where we can really learn from each other is what I mentioned before, is I think, how do we innovate? How do we create the right social impact? And how can we make that actually more efficient and part of our DNA? We as humanitarian organizations, for example, really be even more entrepreneurial, inventive, be sometimes faster. And for companies, it's also like, how can we make our footprint in this world better? And what can we contribute to change some of the realities for the best?
When I mind your background, it's really fascinating. You got this bachelor's in communication and fine arts. You got a master's in fine arts, and I can see how that shaped you to be an artist initially, but you also have an executive MA in international public policy and an executive MA and global leadership. And yet you have transitioned into so many different areas. It's just really, really interesting that you were able to do that. But you're also quite a famous artist and a photographer, painter, author. I mean, you just finished writing a book, and your art has appeared everywhere. Excuse me. I mean, it's been exhibited and sold in some of the most prestigious venues around the world. You're the winner of several international art awards, photography awards, and so on. And I'll ask a question about some of the filming you've done, but how do you go from this kind of background to the things you're doing now, including working with YPO and all of this entrepreneurial work?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. It sounds more than it is, I think. But the beauty about it is, and I give you a simple example. I always loved people, and my curiosity drives me. It's really like it's in me. And I give you an example. Photography, for example, was always for me an excuse to get in touch with people. So by pure philosophy, for example, I only work with what we call wide angle lenses, which means they force me to go very close to people because otherwise you wouldn't see them. Yeah. And the beautiful part about it is that it's every time it's a new encounter, it is meeting someone else, and it means learning. Yeah. Learning and sharing. And this is what always enriched my life and hopefully also the lives of others. And then also in my arts, I was very fortunate because my arts helped me also to finance a lot of my studies. I had my own studio, which my other fellow students didn't have. And it was wonderful to be so creative. But what I missed at that time, in a sense, is really the more direct impact. That's why I started to work during my student years and my artist years. I started to work with homeless people. Then I got into leprosy, and ultimately I created the Color the World Foundation, which has been helping ever since leprosy patients. And that was powerful and enriching. That's why I'm saying, like, the diversity of those different actions have really helped me and helped me also to keep a very diverse view. And as my arts is also extremely colorful, I'm just crazy about colors. I see it always as a representation of the world. The world is full of colors, like the diversity of people who are out there. Everybody's very different.
Now, you got this book that you've written. What inspired that book? What does the book cover? And what do you hope to achieve with the book?
Yeah, so now I've actually just completed my second book. So my first book was actually about Bike for Help, one of my big humanitarian expeditions, which has actually just come out. In the English version has just come out 2 months ago. And I've just completed another book, which is called War, Love, Hope. And it really represents those three words. And I took in this book different anecdotes from the many different conflicts that I worked in, and basically translated them into things that I learned during those moments, whether that's leading in extreme situations. How do you lead a team when everything seems to fall apart? What do you do to pick yourself up when you're actually completely destroyed by what you see? And how people keep love and dignity in some of the most adverse places in the world. And it's been quite an emotional journey because I've written this book. It's over the last 3 years, on and off, whenever I found time. And it's stories of those people, but it's stories that I have experienced. And sometimes I've written these things and I thought, like, wow, it's crazy that I've been there and that I've seen that, and that I have done that. And there's nothing heroic about it. It's just sometimes life, and I think each of us could relate to that. Life brings us sometimes into situations and places we would have never imagined we would be in. And then years later, we think back of that and think, like, oh my God, it was probably one of the most life-changing things, but it was also one of the most difficult experiences of my life.
You've lived such a varied life, and you've seen the most challenging circumstances for humanity and for Earth's ecosystems. And yet many people live in a bubble. So you must have some stories of people living in a bubble where they have no comprehension of what that means to be under so much stress and such disastrous conditions. Can you share any stories where maybe somebody lived in some other circumstance, which was a privilege, and then experienced something that was with no privilege, and what that was for them, how that transformed them?
Yeah, I have a good, I mean, there's many examples, but I think sometimes it's also, I saw my role sometimes as also being, again, that facilitator in a sense. And once I remember it was in my function at the World Economic Forum, where we brought a whole group of CEOs and top level government officials, etc., into some of the refugee camps, the Syrian refugee camps. And it was a very powerful experience, as you can just imagine. For me, let's say, like for me personally, a refugee camp is a natural space. I've spent so many years in camps, for me, it's normal. But then I realized, of course, for probably most of us, absolutely abnormal as a situation that you walk into a camp and what happens actually there. And we brought this group in, and it was a very moving day. And of course, you hear a lot of stories, and of course, there's a lot of stories of drama, but there's also stories of hope. So you just don't just walk out and you're kind of completely destroyed and you think like, oh, the world is falling apart. But it's always, there's hope. And there is something powerful in that. And I remember we went there with the CEO of Orange. And as we walked out of the camp, he said to me, Christoph, I would have never experienced that if you hadn't brought me here. You know, where I operate, where I work and live is so far away from this reality. But he was extremely grateful for what he had experienced. Just simply, it opened his mind. And I remember also one of the CEOs that we brought there was the CEO of Safaricom, which is one of the largest telecom providers in Africa, for example. And one of the consequences of this experience was, he said, like, but it's not so difficult for us to put antennas into the camps, so we could provide, for example, phone connection and internet for free to the refugees. And so he did, you know, a simple step, but it was an inspiration that came out of an experience. And that, I think, is very helpful. It's a transformative experience in every sense, not just what the outcome afterwards is, but it's for every person a transformative experience, you know, for yourself as a leader personally, of how it actually shapes your life.
Yeah, and then the reverberations of that experience then continue to have imprints as they proceed in their journey, and it's one of a betterment, right, for the benefit of humanity and Earth ecosystems. You know, you've got a decoration with the Commander's Cross, the Order of Malta. You've got the World Explorers Award for Achievements in Humanitarian Action. You got the Architect of the Future Award. You got the Global Leadership Fellow from the World Economic Forum. But I think this is really fascinating. You're the winner of maybe like 50, 60 now international film awards for Algeria, a humanitarian expedition. Can you talk about how that came together? And then it must be just fascinating for this film to continue to win these awards. And, you know, and what do you plan in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I made this documentary about this expedition across the Himalayas. So I was cycling across the entire Himalayas, 3,500 kilometers across the highest mountains in the world. I'd never cycled in this altitude. So you can imagine, you arrive there and you're like suddenly on 5,500 meters and you can barely breathe. And what was inspiring about it is, one, it was a campaign. So I ran a national awareness campaign in India for mentally destitute women, in collaboration with the largest institute who's taking care of these women, because it's a big problem in India. Yeah. And what was amazing is, of course, an expedition like that attracted a lot of attention. And suddenly it was all over the news, and particularly young people were very inspired. Oh my God, this young person comes and he cycles across the Himalaya, and he just doesn't do it just to, I don't know, think he's amazing or he's like a super sports person. No, he does it because he wants to bring attention to an important cause. And I had never intended actually to do a documentary about it, but then I was filming sort of on the side, and suddenly I came back and I thought, like, oh, come on, let's put a film together. And then actually came almost the second life of this expedition, and this film went completely out of control. In a sense, it started to win one film award after another, and ultimately I stopped counting at 55. So it's won awards all over the world. But the positive part about it is it brought even more awareness to the challenges. And this is sometimes the beautiful part. And here you see a bit the photography side of it, or my artistic side. It is the storytelling, because the possibility of really telling their stories. And in this case, for example, when I did the expedition, I spent an entire month with these women because I wanted to understand them. This is like when I did Bike for Help for leprosy patients. I spent 2 months with leprosy patients because I wanted to understand their realities, and not just for myself, but I wanted to capture that and get people closer to them, because ultimately they're all also, they might be affected by a disease or have other challenges, but they're just people like you and myself. And suddenly they have a very human face. It is the same when I was sent out for different humanitarian organizations, for example, to do negotiations and etc. The people in front of you, you may not agree with their worldviews or what they do, but ultimately they're also still just people. And that's how you create that entry door. And that moved me a lot, helped me a lot to understand the causes that I'm doing this for, and ultimately also helped to bring it out. And yeah, so then that was a nice side effect, that the documentary traveled all over the world and won these awards, because yeah, it raised a lot more awareness.
Well, we're down to our last question, Christoph. I mean, what recommendations or insights do you want to share with the audience, or maybe actions they can take?
Yeah, so my personal motto is be brave, be kind, be bold. And I think if I can share a few of my insights, I mean, one is what really, really helped me throughout my entire career was this total openness, and I would say the willingness to go always beyond my comfort zone. I still remember, and I give a simple example. When I started to work on the cause of leprosy, I had never seen a leper before, neither. I mean, most of us would probably be scared to meet a person like that. But then you go beyond the comfort zone, and suddenly a relationship develops, and suddenly it's just normal. You sit again in front of a normal person. So lesson number one is push the boundaries of your comfort zone. It might be sometimes really the best and the most life inspiring thing that you can do. And then the second thing is kindness. I think no matter what we do in life, we always have to question our intentions. And I always did, and I saw myself as being part of a responsibility. I mean, coming, for example, from a country where we don't face many of the challenges of the countries that I worked in afterwards, that was a nice sense. I want to give something back. I want to contribute as good as I possibly can. And then it's about the action. Ultimately, be bold, go for it and set it into action. And so many of the people also who will be listening to this now, they do so much, and I think, but it has to be collective. The nice thing is, I think, if we retract ourselves a little bit from what we do, we realize, first of all, collaborating creates always a lot more impact than if we just stand out there alone. And the second thing is it brings us together as communities. And this is, again, it goes to everything back that we talked about before. The more we do it together, whether that's, for example, in a YPO context or in a World Economic Forum context or any other community that we have around us, the more we can actually make happen. I think we're beyond the times of there is the individual hero who does it all. I think we're really we're living in a time where we have to do it together.
Well, thank you, Christoph, for coming in and sharing so much, such beautiful narratives and stories, ones of hope, and ones where there's opportunities for people to have impact in a good way across the world in so many different venues and so on. And you're definitely a model and a template which people can follow to get inspiration and areas where they can actually take action. So I really appreciate you sharing so many of your stories with our audience today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.